Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the March 2022 edition of Socialism for All, and today we're continuing our reading of Blackshirts and Reds, Rational Fascism and the Overthrow of Communism by Michael Parenti. This installment covers Chapter 5 of the book, Stalin's Fingers. In 1989 to 1991, remarkable transformations swept across Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. Communist governments were overthrown. Large portions of their publicly owned economies were dismantled and handed over to private owners at garage sale prices, and one-party rule was replaced with multi-party parliamentary systems. For Western leaders who had tirelessly pursued the rollback of communism, it was a dream come true. If the overthrow of communism was a victory for democracy, as some claimed, it was even more a victory for free market capitalism and conservative anti-communism. Some of the credit should go to the CIA and other Cold War agencies, along with the National Endowment for Democracy, the AFL-CIO, the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, the Pew Charitable Trusts, and various right-wing groups, all of whom funded free market, anti-communist political organizations and publications throughout Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, in what swiftly became the best-financed chain of, quote, revolutions in history. The upheavals occurred with remarkably little violence. As Lech Walesa boasted in November 1989, Polish solidarity overthrew the communist government without breaking a single window. This says at least as much about the government that was overthrown as about the rebels. Rather than acting as might U.S.-supported rulers in El Salvador, Colombia, Zaire, or Indonesia, with death squad terrorism and mass repression, the communists relinquished power almost without firing a shot. The relatively peaceful transition does not fit our image of unscrupulous totalitarians who stop at nothing to maintain power over captive populations. Why didn't the ruthless Reds act more ruthlessly? There's a footnote there. During the mid-1980s, the police in communist Poland shot 44 demonstrators in Gdansk and other cities. 10 former police and army officers were put on trial in 1996 for these killings. In Romania, there reportedly were scores of fatalities in the disturbances immediately preceding the overthrow of Ceausescu, after which Ceausescu and his wife were summarily executed without trial. The killings in Poland and Romania are the sum total of fatalities as far as I know. Back to the text. How many victims? We have heard much about the ruthless Reds, beginning with the reign of terror and repression perpetrated during the dictatorship of Joseph Stalin, 1929 to 1953. Estimates of those who perished under Stalin's rule, based principally on speculations by writers who never reveal how they arrive at such figures, vary wildly. Thus, Roy Medvedev puts Stalin's victims at 5 to 7 million. Robert Conquest decided on 7 to 8 million. Olga Shatunovskaya claims 19.8 million just for the 1935 to 1940 period. Stephen Cohen says 9 million by 1939, with 3 million executed or dying from mistreatment during the 1936 to 39 period, and Arthur Kessler tells us it was 20 to 25 million. More recently, William Rusher of the Claremont Institute refers to the, quote, 100 million people wantonly murdered by communist dictators since the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, unquote, quoting the Oakland Tribune, January 22, 96. And Richard Laurie blames the Stalin era for, quote, the slaughter of millions. New York Times, August 4, 96. Unburdened by any documentation, these, quote, estimates invite us to conclude that the sum total of people incarcerated in the labor camps over a 22-year period, allowing for turnovers due to death and term expirations, would have constituted an astonishing portion of the Soviet population. The support and supervision of the Gulag, all the labor camps, labor colonies, and prisons of the Soviet system, would have been the USSR's single largest enterprise. In the absence of reliable evidence, we're fed anecdotes, such as the story Winston Churchill tells of the time he asked Stalin how many people died in the famine. According to Churchill, the Soviet leader responded by raising both his hands, a gesture that may have signified an unwillingness to broach the subject. But since Stalin happened to have 5 fingers on each hand, Churchill concluded, without benefit of a clarifying follow-up question, that Stalin was confessing to 10 million victims. Would the head of one state especially the secretive Stalin, casually proffer such an admission to the head of another? To this day, Western writers treat this woolly tale as an ironclad confession of mass atrocities. There's a footnote there. Stalin, quote, confided the figure of 10 million to Winston Churchill. Comes from Stephen Cohen, Bukharin and the Bolshevik Revolution, A. Knopf, 1973. No doubt, the famines that occurred during the years of Western invasion, counter-revolutionary intervention, White Guard civil war, and landowner resistance to collectivization took many victims. Back to the text. What we do know of Stalin's purges is that many victims were Communist Party officials, managers, military officers, and other strategically situated individuals whom the dictator saw fit to incarcerate or liquidate. In addition, whole categories of people whom Stalin considered of unreliable loyalty, Cossacks, Crimean Tatars, and ethnic Germans, were selected for internal deportation. Though they never saw the inside of a prison or labor camp, they were subjected to non-custodial resettlement in Central Asia and Siberia. To be sure, crimes of state were committed in communist countries, and many political prisoners were unjustly interned and even murdered. But the inflated numbers offered by Cold War scholars serve neither historical truth nor the cause of justice, but merely help to reinforce a knee-jerk fear and loathing of those terrible Reds. In 1993, for the first time, several historians gained access to previously secret Soviet police archives and were able to establish well-documented estimates of prison and labor camp populations. They found that the total population of the entire Gulag as of January 1939, near the end of the Great Purges, was 2,022,976. There's a footnote there. By way of comparison, in 1995, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, in the United States there were 1.6 million in prison, 3 million on probation, and 700,000 on parole, for a total of 5.3 million under correctional supervision. San Francisco Chronicle, July 1st, 96. Some millions of others have served time, but are no longer connected to the custodial system in any way. Back to the text. At about that time, there began a purge of the purgers, including many intelligence and secret police, NKVD officials, and members of the judiciary and other investigative committees, who were suddenly held responsible for the excesses of the terror, despite their protestations of fidelity to the regime. Another footnote there. That's citing J. Archgetty, Gabor Rittersporn, and Viktor Zemskov in Victims of the Soviet Penal System in the Pre-War Years, a first approach on the basis of archival evidence from the American Historical Review, number 98, October 93, 1017 to 1049. Back to the text. Soviet labor camps were not death camps, like those the Nazis built across Europe. There was no systemic extermination of inmates, no gas chambers or crematoria to dispose of millions of bodies. Despite harsh conditions, the great majority of Gulag inmates survived and eventually returned to society when granted amnesty or when their terms were finished. In any given year, 20 to 40% of the inmates were released, according to archive records. Footnote there, this is again citing the Getty, Rittersporn, and Zemskov article from 93. Back to the text. Oblivious to these facts, the Moscow correspondent of the New York Times, on July 31st, 96, continued to describe the Gulag as, quote, the largest system of death camps in modern history, unquote. Almost 1 million Gulag prisoners were released during World War II to serve in the military. The archives reveal that more than half of all Gulag deaths for the 1934 to 53 period occurred during the war years, 1941 to 45, mostly from malnutrition, when severe privation was the common lot of the entire Soviet population. Some 22 million Soviet citizens perished in the war. In 1944, for instance, the labor camp death rate was 92 per 1,000. By 1953, with the post-war recovery, camp deaths had declined to 3 per 1,000. It's again citing the Getty article. Should all Gulag inmates be considered innocent victims of Red repression? Contrary to what we have been led to believe, those arrested for political crimes or, quote, counter-revolutionary offenses numbered from 12 to 33% of the prison population, varying from year to year. The vast majority of inmates were charged with non-political offenses: murder, assault, theft, banditry, smuggling, swindling, and other violations punishable in any society. It's again citing the Getty article. Total executions from 1921 to 53, a 33-year span inclusive, were 799,455. No breakdown of this figure was provided by the researchers. It includes those who were guilty of non-political capital crimes, as well as those who collaborated in the Western capitalist invasion and subsequent White Guard army atrocities. It also includes some of the considerable numbers who collaborated with the Nazis during World War II and probably German SS prisoners. In any case, the killings of political opponents were not in the millions or tens of millions, which is not to say that the actual number was either inconsequential or justifiable. The three historians who studied the heretofore secret Gulag records concluded that the number of victims were far less than usually claimed in the West. This finding is ridiculed by anti-communist liberal Adam Hochschild, who prefers to repeat Churchill's story about Stalin's fingers. New York Times, May 8, 96. Like many others, Hochschild has no trouble accepting undocumented speculations about the Gulag, but much difficulty accepting the documented figures drawn from NKVD archives. Where did the Gulag go? Some Russian anti-communist writers, such as Solzhenitsyn and Sakharov, and many U.S. anti-communist liberals, maintain that the Gulag existed right down to the last days of communism. There's a footnote there. The term Gulag was incorporated into the English language, in part because constant references were made to its presumed continued existence. A senior fellow at the liberal-oriented Institute for Policy Studies, Robert Borsage, sent me a note in December 1982, emphatically stating in part that, quote, the Gulag exists. When I gave talks at college campuses during the 1980s about President Reagan's domestic spending policies, I repeatedly encountered faculty members who, regardless of the topic under discussion, insisted that I also talk about the Gulag, which, they said, still contained many millions of victims. My refusal to genuflect to that orthodoxy upset a number of them. Back to the text. If so, where did it disappear to? After Stalin's death in 1953, more than half of the Gulag inmates were freed, according to the study of the NKVD files previously cited. But if so many others remained incarcerated, why haven't they materialized? When the communist states were overthrown, where were the half-starved hordes pouring out of the internment camps with their tales of travail? One of the last remaining Soviet labor camps, Parenti 35, was visited in 1989 by Republican congressmen, and again in 1990 by French journalists. See Washington Post, November 28, 89, and National Geographic, March 90, respectively. Both parties found only a few dozen prisoners, some of whom were identified as outright spies. Others were, quote, refuseniks who had been denied the right to emigrate. Prisoners worked 8 hours a day, 6 days a week, for 250 rubles or $40 a month. What of the supposedly vast numbers of political prisoners, said to exist in the other, quote, communist totalitarian police states, unquote, of Eastern Europe? Why no evidence of their mass release in the post-communist era? And where are the massive political prisoners in Cuba? Asked about this, Professor Alberto Prieto of the University of Havana pointed out that even a recent State Department report on human rights showed hundreds of people being tortured, killed, or, quote, disappeared in almost all the Latin American countries, but mentions only 6 alleged political prisoners in reference to Cuba, citing People's Weekly World, February 26, 94. If there were mass atrocities right down to the last days of communism, why did not the newly installed anti-communist regimes seize the opportunity to bring erstwhile communist rulers to justice? Why no Nuremberg-style public trials documenting widespread atrocities? Why were not hundreds of party leaders and security officials and thousands of camp guards rounded up and tried for the millions that they supposedly exterminated? The best the West Germans could do was to charge East German leader Erich Honecker, several other officials, and 7 border guards with shooting people who tried to escape over the Berlin Wall, a serious charge but hardly indicative of a gulag. Authorities in the Western Capitalist Federal Republic of Germany, FRG, did contrive a charge of treason against persons who served as officials, military officers, soldiers, judges, attorneys, and others of the now-defunct German Democratic Republic, GDR, a sovereign nation that once had full standing in the United Nations, and most of whose citizens had never been subjects of the FRG. As of 1996, more than 300, quote, treason cases had been brought to trial, including a former GDR intelligence chief, a defense minister, and 6 generals, all indicted for carrying out what were their legal duties under the constitution and laws of the GDR, in some instances fighting fascism and CIA sabotage. Many of the defendants were eventually acquitted, but a number were sentenced to prison. What we witness here is the Nuremberg trials in reverse, Reds put on trial for their anti-fascist efforts by West German, friendly to fascism prosecutors, using a retroactive application of FRG penal law for GDR citizens. As of the beginning of 1997, several thousand more trials were expected. Footnote there, the vice president of the highest court in the GDR was a man named Reinvard, who had been put in a concentration camp by the Nazis during the war, and who was the presiding judge in trials that convicted several CIA agents for sabotage. He was sentenced in 1996 to 3.5 years. Helena Heyman, who had been imprisoned during the Hitler regime for her anti-Nazi activities, later was a judge in the GDR, where she presided over anti-sabotage trials. She was put on trial in 1996. When her conviction was read out, it was pointed out by the judge that an additional factor against her was that she was trained by a Jewish lawyer who had been a defense attorney for the Communists and Social Democrats. Also put on trial were GDR soldiers who served as border guards. More than 20 GDR soldiers were shot to death from the western side in various incidents that went unreported in the Western press. This is citing Klaus Fisk. Witch hunt trials of East German leaders continue. People's Weekly World, October 1996. These trials are in direct violation of the FRG-GDR Unification Treaty, which states that any criminal prosecution of acts undertaken in the GDR is to be done in accordance with GDR laws operative at the time. Back to the text. In 1995, Miroslav Stefan, the former secretary of the Prague Communist Party, was sentenced to 2.5 years for ordering Czech police to use tear gas and water cannons against demonstrators in 1988. Is this the best example of bloodthirsty red oppression that the capitalist restorationists in Czechoslovakia could find? An action that doesn't even qualify as a crime in most Western nations? In 1996 in Poland, 12 elderly Stalin-era political policemen were sentenced to prison for having beaten and mistreated prisoners over 50 years earlier during the communist takeover after World War II, per the San Francisco Chronicle, March 9, 96. Again, one might wonder why post-communist leaders seeking to bring the communist tyrants to justice could find nothing more serious to prosecute than a police assault case from a half-century before. Most of those incarcerated in the Gulag were not political prisoners, and the same appears to be true of inmates in the other communist states. In 1989, when the millionaire playwright Vaclav Havel became president of Czechoslovakia, he granted amnesty to about 2/3 of the country's prison population, which numbered not in the millions but in the thousands. Havel assumed that most of those incarcerated under communism were victims of political repression and therefore deserved release. He and his associates were dismayed to discover that a good number were experienced criminals who lost no time in resuming their unsavory pursuits, per the New York Times, December 18, 91. Memories of Maldevelopment. In Chapter 2, I discussed the role of popular revolution in advancing the condition of humankind. That analysis would apply as well to communist revolutions, and is worth reiterating in the present context. We hear a great deal about the crimes of communism, but almost nothing about its achievements. The communist governments inherited societies burdened with an age-old legacy of economic exploitation and maldevelopment. Much of pre-communist Eastern Europe, as with pre-revolutionary Russia and China, was in effect a third world region with widespread poverty and almost non-existent capital formation. Most rural transportation was still by horse and wagon. The devastation of World War II added another heavy layer of misery upon the region, reducing hundreds of villages and many cities to rubble. It was the communists and their allies who rebuilt these societies. While denounced in the U.S. press for leaving their economies in bad shape, in fact, the Reds left the economy of Eastern Europe in far better condition than they found it. The same was true of China. Henry Rosemont Jr. notes that when the Communists liberated Shanghai from the U.S.-supported reactionary Kuomintang regime in 1949, about 20% of that city's population, an estimated 1.2 million, were drug addicts. Every morning there were special street crews whose, quote, sole task was to gather up the corpses of the children, adults, and the elderly who had been murdered during the night or had been abandoned and died of disease, cold, and/or starvation, quoting from Z Magazine, October 95. During the years of Stalin's reign, the Soviet nation made dramatic gains in literacy, industrial wages, healthcare, and women's rights. These accomplishments usually go unmentioned when the Stalinist era is discussed. To say that socialism doesn't work is to overlook the fact that it did. In Eastern Europe, Russia, China, Mongolia, North Korea, and Cuba, revolutionary communism created a life for the mass of people that was far better than the wretched existence they had endured under feudal lords, military bosses, foreign colonizers, and Western capitalists. The end result was a dramatic improvement in living conditions for hundreds of millions of people on a scale never before or since witnessed in history. State socialism transformed desperately poor countries into modernized societies in which everyone had enough food, clothing, and shelter, where elderly people had secure pensions, and where all children and many adults went to school and no one was denied medical attention. Some of us from poor families who carry around the hidden injuries of class are much impressed by these achievements and are unwilling to dismiss them as merely, quote, economistic. But what of the democratic rights that these peoples were denied? In fact, with the exception of Czechoslovakia, these countries had known little political democracy in the days before communism. Russia was a czarist autocracy, Poland a rightist dictatorship with concentration camps of its own, Albania an Italian fascist protectorate as early as 1927, Cuba a U.S.-sponsored dictatorship, Lithuania, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria were outright fascist regimes, allied with Nazi Germany in World War II. Then there were the distorting effects that unremitting capitalist encirclement had upon the building of socialism. Throughout its entire 73-year history of counter-revolutionary invasion, civil war, forced industrialization, Stalinist purges and deportations, Nazi conquest, Cold War, and the nuclear arms race, the Soviet Union did not know one day of peaceful development. In the attempt to maintain military parity with the United States, the Soviets took on crushing defense costs that seriously depleted their civilian economy. In addition, they faced monetary boycott, trade discrimination, and technological embargo from the West. The people who lived under communism endured chronic shortages, long lines, poor quality goods and services, and many other problems. They wanted a better life, and who could blame them? Without capitalist encirclement, they would have had a better chance of solving more of their internal problems. All this is not to deny the very real deficiencies of the communist systems. Here I want to point out that much of the credit for the deformation and overthrow of communism should go to the Western forces that tirelessly dedicated themselves to that task, using every possible means of political, economic, military, and diplomatic aggression to achieve a success that will continue to cost the people of the world dearly. And that's the end of Chapter 5. Now going on to Chapter 6, The Free Market Paradise Goes East, Part 1. Capitalist restoration in the former communist countries has taken different forms. In Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, it involved the overthrow of communist governments. In China, it proceeded within the framework of a communist system, as seems to be happening in Vietnam, and perhaps will happen eventually in North Korea and Cuba. While the Chinese government continues under a nominally communist leadership, the process of private capital penetration goes on more or less unhindered. Suppression of the left. The anti-communists who took power in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union in 1989-91 set about to impose bourgeois dominance over political and cultural life, purging communists from government, the media, universities, professions, and courts. While presenting themselves as democratic reformers, they soon grew impatient with the way that democratic forms of popular resistance limited their efforts to install an unrestrained free market capitalism. In Russia, associates of President Boris Yeltsin talked of the, quote, dangers of democracy and complained that, quote, most representative bodies have become a hindrance to our market reforms," unquote, quoting The Nation, December 2, 91, and May 4, 92. Apparently, the free market, said by, quote, reformers to be the very foundation of political democracy, could not be introduced through democratic means. In 1992, the presidents of Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Russia demanded that their parliaments be suspended and that they be allowed to rule by presidential decree, with repressive measures against, quote, hardliners and, quote, holdovers who resisted the free market reforms. Their goal was not power to the people, but profits to the privileged. This process of democratization via suppression began even before the actual overthrow of communism. In 1991, Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev, prodded by Russian President Yeltsin, announced that the Communist Party of the USSR no longer had legal status. The party's membership funds and buildings were confiscated. Workers were prohibited from engaging in any type of political activities in the workplace. 6 leftist newspapers were suppressed, while all other publications, many of them openly reactionary, enjoyed uninterrupted distribution. The U.S. media, and even many on the U.S. left, hailed these acts of suppression as, quote, moving ahead with democratic reforms. So I just want to comment here, the importance of what was just mentioned is hard to overstate. Saying that the Communist Party of the USSR no longer had legal status is a watershed event. Watershed actually doesn't even really cover it. The party had been the basis of the entire Federation's political life for decades. There was effectively no other existing established way to do the USSR. Parenti's about to get into more of the details of what prompted this, but I mean, this is such a radical departure. Basically, eliminating the party is tantamount to eliminating the country itself due to the way that it had been run. Let's continue with the text and then pick up maybe with more comments after. Continuing. Gorbachev then demanded that the Soviet Congress abolish itself. It had remained too resistant to change. Well, actually, the Congress was not opposed to democratic debate and multi-party elections. These were already in practice. It resisted an unbridled free market capitalism, and for that reason, it would have to go. Gorbachev repeatedly cut off the microphones during debate and threatened single-handedly to abolish the Congress by emergency decree. He forced a vote 3 times until he got the desired abolition. These strong-arm methods were reported in the U.S. press without critical comment. What gave Yeltsin and Gorbachev the excuse to pursue this repressive course was the curious incident of August 1991, when a nervous group of leaders, mouthing vague phrases about the deterioration of life in the Soviet Union, attempted an oddly orchestrated coup against the Gorbachev government, one that flopped before it ever got off the ground. Weeks later, the Washington Post, September 26, 91, noted happily that the defeat of the coup was a triumph for the Soviet-moneyed class. Among the coup's militant opponents were private entrepreneurs and thousands of members of the Russian stock exchange, who routinely made 20 times the average wage of ordinary Soviets. They headed onto, quote, the streets of Moscow to defend their right to wheel and deal. The coup collapsed. Democracy triumphed. Private businessmen contributed more than 15 million rubles to buy food and equipment for the defenders, unquote. One broker was struck by how few workers responded to Yeltsin's call to defend democracy. Well, gee, how interesting. The boldness of this investor class in the face of an armed coup might have another explanation. A socialist critic of communism, Boris Kagarlitsky, argued, quote, in fact, there was no coup at all, unquote. The soldiers were unarmed and confused, the tanks called out were undirected, and, quote, the leaders of the so-called coup never even seriously tried to take power, unquote. The real coup, says Kagarlitsky, came in the aftermath, when Boris Yeltsin used the incident to exceed his constitutional powers and dismantle the Soviet Union itself, absorbing all its powers into his own Russian Republic. While claiming to be undoing the, quote, old regime, Yeltsin overthrew the new democratic Soviet government of 1989 to 1991. So just to comment here, a lot was happening in the USSR at this time. As mentioned previously, there were a number of reforms being introduced by Gorbachev for a number of years. However, they felt that these weren't proceeding fast enough in paving the way for capitalism, hence all of this stuff. But I mean, even the USSR itself was up for debate and discussion. There was something called the New Union Treaty, which could have changed some of the fundamental relationships between the various Soviet Socialist republics. However, following the August coup and then these emergency actions that led basically straight into capitalism, that was pretty much the end. As Parenti says, while claiming to be undoing the old regime, Yeltsin overthrew the new democratic Soviet government of 89 to 91. Continuing, in late 1993, facing strong popular resistance to his harsh, free market policies, Yeltsin went further. He forcibly disbanded the Russian parliament and every other elected representative body in the country, including municipal and regional councils. He abolished Russia's constitutional court and launched an armed attack upon the parliamentary building, killing an estimated 2,000 resistors and demonstrators. Thousands more were jailed without charges or a trial, and hundreds of elected officials were placed under investigation. So commenting, when I say that the USSR was destroyed, a lot of people say the USSR fell. I have tried to correct that habit in myself by replacing fell with was destroyed. The USSR was destroyed. This is the process by which it was destroyed. It's not like the economy was, failing for a long time and then finally the wheels came off. This was very deliberate political sabotage and assaults. The reform process, to the extent that it was sincere and not just a Trojan horse, was not really given a fair chance. And, the people behind the coup basically just decided, this is taking too long, let's just go in and topple it. So continuing. Yeltsin banned labor unions from all political activities, suppressed dozens of publications, exercised monopoly control over all broadcast media, and permanently outlawed 15 political parties. He unilaterally scrapped the Constitution and presented the public with a new one that gave the president nearly absolute power over policy while reducing the democratically elected parliament to virtual impotence. There's a footnote there. The new Constitution was seemingly approved in a December 1993 referendum. However, a commission appointed by Yeltsin himself found that only 46% of eligible voters had participated, rather than the 50% required to ratify a constitution, quoting LA Times, June 3, 94. Little note has been taken of the fact that Yeltsin was ruling under an illegal constitution. Back to the text. For these crimes, he was hailed as a defender of democracy by U.S. leaders and media. What they most liked about Yeltsin was that he, quote, never wavered in his support for privatization, quoting San Francisco Chronicle, July 6, 1994. Footnote there, for a more detailed account of the Yeltsin repression and the whitewash it received in the U.S. media, see Yeltsin's Coup and the Media's Alchemy in Michael Parenti, Dirty Truths, City Light Books, 1996. Back to the text. Yeltsin, the, quote, Democrat, twice suspended publication of the Communist Party newspaper Pravda. He charged it exorbitant rent for the use of its own facilities. Then, in March 1992, he confiscated the paper's 12-story building and its press and turned full ownership over to Rossiyskaya Gazeta, a government, or pro-Yeltsin newspaper. Yeltsin's elite Oman troops repeatedly attacked leftist demonstrators and pickets in Moscow and other Russian cities. Parliamentary deputy Andrei Edzertsis, an independent, and Deputy Valentin Martemyanov, a communist, who both vigorously opposed the Yeltsin government, were victims of political assassination. In 1994, journalist Dmitry Kolodov, who was probing corruption in high places, also was assassinated. In 1996, Yeltsin won re-election as president, beating out a serious challenge from a communist rival. His campaign was assisted by teams of U.S. electoral advisors, who used sophisticated polling techniques and focus groups. There's a footnote there. These U.S. political consultants operated in strict secrecy, lest they be seen as interfering in Russian affairs, which indeed they were. They advised Yeltsin against making extended speeches and urged more sound bites and photo opportunities. They pointed to issues and images he could exploit and ones he should avoid. Political scientist Larry Sabato, who long opposed the involvement of U.S. consultants in foreign elections, observed that Americans can be stripped of their citizenship for voting in a foreign election. Quote, "Why then should it be acceptable to influence millions of votes in a foreign election?" Unquote. I would add that no foreigner is allowed to contribute money to U.S. candidates or work on their campaign staffs, but U.S. leaders can send large sums and secret teams of consultants to manipulate and sway foreign elections. Just another example of the double standard under which U.S. policy operates. Back to the text. Yeltsin also benefited from multi-million-dollar donations from U.S. sources and a $10 billion aid package from the International Monetary Fund and World Bank. Equally important for victory was the crooked counting of ballots, as cursorily reported in one ABC late evening news story in July 1996. Yeltsin exercised monopoly control over Russia's television networks, enjoying campaign coverage that amounted to non-stop promotionals. In contrast, opposition candidates were reduced to non-persons, given only fleeting exposure, if that. Yeltsin's re-election was hailed in the West as a victory for democracy. In fact, it was a victory for private capital and monopoly media, which is not synonymous with democracy, though often treated as such by U.S. leaders and opinion makers. Yeltsin's commitment is to capitalism, not democracy. In March 1996, several months before the election, when polls showed him trailing the communist candidate, Gennady Zyuganov, Yeltsin ordered decrees drawn up, quote, that would have canceled the election, closed down parliament, and banned the Communist Party, quoting the New York Times, July 2, 96. But he was dissuaded by advisors who feared the measures might incite too much resistance. Though he decided not to call off the election, quote, Yeltsin was never committed to turning over the government to a communist if he lost, unquote. It's from the San Francisco Chronicle, July 26, 96. During the 1996 campaign, Yeltsin and his associates repeatedly announced that a communist victory would bring, quote, civil war. In effect, they were voicing their willingness to discard democracy and resort to force and violence if the election didn't go their way. Nor was it taken as an idle threat. At one point, surveys showed that, quote, about half the population believed that civil war would result if the communists won, quoting Sacramento Bee, July 9, 96. Through all of this, Yeltsin received vigorous support from the White House and the U.S. media. An editorial in The Nation, 6/17/96, asked, what if a popularly elected communist president in Russia had pursued Yeltsin's harsh policies of privatization, plunging his country into poverty, turning over most of its richest assets to a small segment of previously communist officials, suppressing dissident elements, using tanks to disband a popularly elected parliament that opposed his policies, rewriting the Constitution to give himself almost dictatorial power, and doing all the other things that Yeltsin has done? Would U.S. leaders enthusiastically devote themselves to the re-election of this communist president and remain all but silent about his transgressions? The question is posed rhetorically. The Nation editorial presumes that the answer is no. In fact, I would respond, yes, of course. U.S. leaders would have no trouble supporting this, quote, communist president, for he would be communist in name only. In actual deed, he would be a devoted agent of capitalist restoration. One need only look at how successive administrations in Washington have cultivated friendly relations with the present communist leaders in China, overlooking and even explaining away their transgressions. As China's leaders open their country to private investment and growing economic inequality, they offer up a dispossessed labor force, ready to work double digits hours for subsistence pay, at enormous profit for the multinationals. U.S. politico-economic leaders know what they are doing, even if some editorial writers in this country do not. Their eye is on the money, not the color of the vessel it comes in. Since the overthrow of communism, free market right-wing forces in the various Eastern European countries enjoyed significant financial and organizational assistance from U.S.-financed agencies, such as the National Endowment for Democracy, the AFL-CIO's Free Trade Union Institute, a group intimately linked to the CIA, and the Free Congress Foundation, an organization with an anti-communist and conservative religious ideology. There's a footnote there. The reader might want to consult the late Sean Gervasi's 2 in-depth studies on Western destabilization of the Soviet Union, Covert Action Quarterly, Fall 1990, and Winter 1991-92. Back to the text. Communists and other Marxists endured political repression throughout Eastern Europe. In East Germany, the Party of Democratic Socialism had its property and offices, paid for by party members, seized in an attempt to bankrupt it. In Latvia, the communist activist Alfreds Rubiks, who protested the inequities of free market, quote, reform, has been kept in prison for years without benefit of trial. In Lithuania, communist leaders were tortured and then imprisoned for long durations. Georgia's anti-communist president, Zviad Gamsakhurdia, incarcerated opponents from some 70 political groups without granting them a trial, citing San Francisco Chronicle, April 17, 91. Estonia held, quote, free elections, in which 42% of the population was prohibited from voting because of their Russian, Ukrainian, or Belarusian antecedents. Russians and other minorities were excluded from many jobs and faced discrimination in housing and schools. Latvia also disfranchised Russians and other non-Latvian nationals, many of whom had lived in the country for almost a half-century. So much for the flowering of democracy. There's a footnote there. The focus here is mostly on the former communist countries of Eastern Europe and Russia, but similar and more bloody repressions against deposed left revolutionaries have been conducted in Afghanistan and South Yemen. In 1995, in Ethiopia, 3,000 former members of Mengistu Haile Mariam's socialist government were put on trial for executing Emperor Haile Selassie, the feudal despot who once ruled that country. Back to the text. One-way democracy. More important than democratic rule was free market, quote, reform, a code word for capitalist restoration. As long as democracy could be used to destabilize one-party communist rule, it was championed by the forces of reaction. But when democracy worked against free market restoration, the outcome was less tolerated. In 1990, in Bulgaria, capitalist restoration did not go according to plan. Despite generous financial and organizational assistance from U.S. sources, including the Free Congress Foundation, the Bulgarian conservatives ended up a poor second to the communists in what Western European observers judged to be a fair and open election. What followed was a coordinated series of strikes, demonstrations, economic pressure, acts of sabotage, and other disruptions reminiscent of CIA-orchestrated campaigns against left governments in Chile, Jamaica, Nicaragua, and British Guiana. Within 5 months, the free market oppositionists forced the democratically elected communist government to resign. Bulgarian communists, quote, complained that the U.S. had violated democratic principles in working against freely elected officials. There's a footnote there. For information on Bulgaria, see William Blum's report in Covert Action Quarterly, Winter 94-95. Back to the text. The same pattern emerged in Albania, where the democratically elected communist government won an overwhelming victory at the polls, only to face demonstrations, a general strike, economic pressure from abroad, and campaigns of disruption, financed by the National Endowment for Democracy and other U.S. sources. After 2 months, the communist government collapsed. Once the right took power, a new law was passed, denying Albanian communists and other opponents of capitalist restoration the right to vote or otherwise participate in political activities. As a reward for having extended democratic rights to all citizens, the Albanian communists and all former state employees and judges were stripped of their civil rights. In the 1996 Albanian elections, the socialists and other opposition parties, who had been predicted to do well, withdrew from the election hours before the polls closed in protest of the, quote, blatantly rigged vote. Election monitors from the European Union and the United States said that they witnessed numerous instances of police intimidation and the stuffing of ballot boxes. The Socialist Party had its final campaign rally banned, and a number of prominent leaders barred from running for office because of their past communist affiliations, citing New York Times, May 28, 96. When the socialists and their allies tried to hold protest rallies, they were attacked by Albanian security forces, who beat and severely injured dozens of demonstrators, citing People's Weekly World, May 11, 96 and June 1, 96. Openly anti-Semitic groups, crypto-fascist parties, and hate campaigns surfaced in Russia, Poland, Hungary, Ukraine, Belarus, Czechoslovakia, and Romania. Museums that commemorated the heroic anti-fascist resistance were closed down, and monuments to the struggle against Nazism were dismantled. In countries like Lithuania, former Nazi war criminals were exonerated, some even compensated for the years that they had spent in jail. Jewish cemeteries were desecrated, and xenophobic attacks against foreigners of darker hue increased. With the communists no longer around, Jews and foreigners were blamed for low crop prices, inflation, crime, and other social ills. On June 11, 1995, Lech Walesa's personal pastor, Father Henryk Jankowski, declared during a mass in Warsaw that the, quote, Star of David is implicated in the swastika as well as in the hammer and sickle, unquote, and that the, quote, diabolical aggressiveness of the Jews was responsible for the emergence of communism, unquote, and for World War II. The priest added that Poles should not tolerate governments made up of people who were tied to Jewish money. Walesa, who was present during the sermon, declared that his friend Jankowski was not an anti-Semite, but simply, quote, misinterpreted. Rather than retracting his comments, Jankowski spewed forth the same bile in a subsequent television interview. At about that time, placards that read, quote, Jews to the gas, and, quote, down with the Jewish communist conspiracy, were visible at a Polish solidarity demonstration of 10,000 in Warsaw, earning not a censorious word from church or state authorities. Citing The Nation, August 7, 1995. The economic policies of the fascist Pinochet regime in Chile were openly admired by the newly installed capitalist government in Hungary. In 1991, leading political figures and economists from the soon-to-be-abolished USSR attended a seminar on Chilean economics in Santiago and enjoyed a cordial meeting with mass murderer General Pinochet. The Chilean dictator also was accorded a friendly interview in Literaturная Gazeta, a major Russian publication. Yeltsin's former security chief, Alexander Lebed, is a Pinochet admirer. Instead of being transformed into capitalist states, some communist nations were entirely obliterated as political entities. Besides the obvious example of the Soviet Union, there is the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany, which was absorbed into the Federal Republic of Germany. South Yemen was militarily attacked and crushed by North Yemen. Ethiopia was occupied by Tigrayan and Eritrean forces that imprisoned large numbers of Ethiopians without trial, expropriated Ethiopian property, suppressed Ethiopian education, business, and news media, and imposed a, quote, systematic enforcement of tribalism in political organization and education. Citing Tilahun Yilma in Correspondence and New York Times, April 24, 1996. A systematic enforcement of tribalist political organization might well describe Yugoslavia's fate, a nation that was fragmented by force of arms into a number of small, conservative republics under the suzerainty of the Western powers. With that dismemberment came a series of wars, repressions, and atrocities committed by all contending sides. One of Yugoslavia's first breakaway republics was Croatia, which in 1990 was taken over by a rightist coterie, including some former Nazi collaborators, backed by the armed might of the proto-fascist National Guard Corps, under a constitution that relegated Serbs, Jews, Gypsies, and Muslims to second-class status. Serbs were driven from the civil service and police, evicted from their homes, had their businesses taken from them, and were subjected to special property taxes. Serbian newspapers in Croatia were suppressed. Many Serbs were forced from the land that they had inhabited for 3 centuries. Still, Croatia was hailed by its Western backers as a newborn democracy. In 1996, Belarus President Alexander Lukashenko, a self-professed admirer of Adolf Hitler's organizational skills, shut down the independent newspapers and radio stations and decreed the opposition parliament defunct. Lukashenko was awarded absolute power in a referendum that claimed an inflated turnout, with no one knowing how many ballots were printed or how they were counted. Some opposition leaders fled for their lives. Quote, once a rich Soviet republic that produced tractors and TVs, Belarus is now a basket case, with a third of the population living, quote, in deep poverty, quoting the San Francisco Bay Guardian, December 4, 1996. So commenting, that's the end of that section. I just want to point out that the Belarus president, Alexander Lukashenko, who is still the Belarus president in 2022, has been in power since 1994. It's the same guy. And in the context of the current Russian invasion of Ukraine, Belarus has been an ally of Putin in that invasion. Many a, quote, anti-imperialist has praised Lukashenko on social media in recent years for insulting U.S. journalists or this or that. But if anti-imperialist is going to actually mean anything, it needs to be rooted in socialist politics of class struggle. Is that the case with this guy? No, it is not. And this is just one example. In fact, Parenti's book was written in '97. Lukashenko has had a long career since then and has continued to make similar comments. If you're a socialist, this is not your guy. Continuing. Must we adore Vaclav Havel? No figure among the capitalist restorationists in the East has won more adulation from U.S. officials, media pundits, and academics than Vaclav Havel, a playwright who became the first president of post-communist Czechoslovakia and later president of the Czech Republic. The many left-leaning people who also admire Havel seem to have overlooked some things about him: his reactionary religious obscurantism, his undemocratic suppression of leftist opponents, and his profound dedication to economic inequality and an unrestrained free market capitalism. Raised by governesses and chauffeurs in a wealthy and fervently anti-communist family, Havel denounced democracy's, quote, cult of objectivity and statistical average, and the idea that rational, collective social efforts should be applied to solving the environmental crisis. He called for a new breed of political leader who would rely less on, quote, rational cognitive thinking, show, quote, humility in the face of the mysterious order of being, capital B, and, quote, trust in his own subjectivity as his principal link with the subjectivity of the world, unquote. Apparently, this new breed of leader would be a superior elitist cogitator, not unlike Plato's philosopher king, endowed with a, quote, sense of transcendental responsibility and, quote, archetypal wisdom, unquote. There's a footnote there. See Havel's goofy op-ed in the New York Times, March 1st, '92. It caused an embarrassed silence among his U.S. admirers. Back to the text. Havel never explained how this transcendent and archetypal wisdom would translate into actual policy decisions, and for whose benefit, at whose expense. Havel called for efforts to preserve the Christian family in the Christian nation, presenting himself as a man of peace and stating that he would never sell arms to oppressive regimes. He sold weapons to the Philippines and the fascist regime in Thailand. In June 1994, General Pinochet, the man who butchered Chilean democracy, was reported to be arms shopping in Czechoslovakia, with no audible objections from Havel. Havel joined wholeheartedly in George Bush's Gulf War, an enterprise that killed over 100,000 Iraqi civilians. In 1991, along with other Eastern European pro-capitalist leaders, Havel voted with the United States to condemn human rights violations in Cuba, but he never uttered a word of condemnation of rights violations in El Salvador, Colombia, Indonesia, or any other U.S. client state. In 1992, while president of Czechoslovakia, Havel, the great Democrat, demanded that Parliament be suspended and he be allowed to rule by edict, the better to ram through free market, quote, reforms. That same year, he signed a law that made the advocacy of communism a felony, with a penalty of up to 8 years imprisonment. He claimed that the Czech constitution required him to sign it. In fact, as he knew, the law violated the Charter of Human Rights, which is incorporated into the Czech constitution. In any case, it did not require his signature to become law. In 1995, he supported and signed another undemocratic law barring communists and former communists from employment in public agencies. The propagation of anti-communism has remained a top priority for Havel. He led, quote, a frantic international campaign, quoting the San Francisco Chronicle, February 17, '95, to keep in operation 2 U.S.-financed Cold War radio stations, Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, so that they could continue saturating Eastern Europe with their anti-communist propaganda. Under Havel's government, a law was passed making it a crime to propagate national, religious, and class hatred. In effect, criticisms of big-moneyed interests were now illegal, being unjustifiably lumped with ethnic and religious bigotry. Havel's government warned labor unions not to involve themselves in politics. Some militant unions had their property taken from them and handed over to compliant company unions. In 1995, Havel announced that the, quote, revolution against communism would not be complete until everything was privatized. Havel's government liquidated the properties of the Socialist Union of Youth, which included campsites, recreation halls, and cultural and scientific facilities for children, putting the properties under the management of 5 joint stock companies at the expense of the youth who were left to roam the streets. Under Czech privatization and, quote, restitution programs, factories, shops, estates, homes, and much of the public land was sold at bargain prices to foreign and domestic capitalists. In the Czech and Slovak republics, former aristocrats or their heirs were being given back all the lands their families had held before 1918 under the Austro-Hungarian Empire, dispossessing the previous occupants and sending many of them into destitution. Havel himself took personal ownership of public properties that had belonged to his family 40 years before. While presenting himself as a man dedicated to doing good for others, he did well for himself. For these reasons, some of us do not have warm, fuzzy feelings toward Václav Havel. Comment, that's the end of page 99. For some reason, my copy skips pages 100 and 101. So, unfortunately, missing 2 pages. Moving on to page 102, we come in mid-sentence. Quote, in a country that cared about its workers, unquote, said one machinist who now was sorry that he had opposed that system. New York Times, May 8, 94. In Macedonia, one of the breakaway republics of Yugoslavia, a labor representative noted, quote, privatization seems to mean the destruction of our companies, unquote. Macedonians seemed more troubled by free market economic hardships than by the much publicized ethnic rivalries. They complained about how work has taken over their lives. Quote, one has no time to care about others. There's no time even for oneself. Only time for making money, unquote. PBS TV report, January 16, 95. Comment, again, this whole, gee, I didn't realize what we had till it was gone. What were they teaching these people, honestly? These are like incredibly fundamental things in Marxism. Of course, we're talking about Yugoslavia, so this was Tito, but still, it seems to be kind of a common refrain. These are like incredibly fundamental things in Marxism. Of course, we're talking about Yugoslavia, so this was Tito, but still, it seems to be kind of a common refrain. Oh, gee, I didn't realize how bad capitalism was. Yeah, that's sort of why your ancestors fought a revolution against it. And in countries that didn't have a revolution, it's why your ancestors participated in the labor movement, often making great sacrifices to win gains on the shop floor, to have more economic rights with respect to the job, even if capitalists were still in power. And again, people let the labor movement go slack. What have been the consequences? Ruin. Just ruin. Continuing. Agricultural output of grain, corn, livestock, and other products plummeted in the former communist countries as thousands of cooperative farms were forcibly broken up. The new private farmers have small plots, often cannot get loans, seeds, fertilizer, or machinery, and are rapidly losing their holdings or reverting to subsistence farming. Hungary's agricultural cooperatives had been one sector of the socialist economy that performed well, but with privatization, farm output tumbled 40% in 1993, citing LA Times, January 29, 94. A drastic deterioration in agricultural production occurred in Bulgaria, once considered the breadbasket of Eastern Europe, causing severe bread shortages by 1996. Bulgaria was also suffering from a 20% monthly inflation and was sinking into that familiar cycle of foreign debt, cutting back on services to qualify for IMF loans, borrowing to pay off past borrowing. Quote, the Bulgarian government must impose more free market austerity measures to get vital international loans to repay portions of the $9.4 billion foreign debt. Quoting San Francisco Chronicle, July 18, 96. In 1992, the Lithuanian government decreed that former owners and their descendants could reclaim property confiscated during the socialist era. As a result, tens of thousands of farming families, about 70% of the rural population, were evicted from land that they had worked for over a half-century. destroying the country's agricultural base in the process. Much production in East Germany was dismantled to prevent competition with West German firms. This was especially evident when collective agriculture was broken up to protect the heavily subsidized and less productive private farms of West Germany. There's a footnote there. See Robert McIntyre's report in Monthly Review, December 93. Back to the text. Without making compensation, West German capitalists grabbed almost all the socialized property in the GDR, including factories, mills, farms, apartments, and other real estate, and the medical care system, assets worth about $2 trillion, in what has amounted to the largest expropriation of public wealth by private capital in European history. The end result of all this free market privatization in East Germany is that rents, once 5% of one's income, have climbed to as much as 2/3. Likewise, the costs of transportation, childcare, healthcare, and higher education have soared beyond the reach of many. East Germans of various political stripes have a number of complaints. A. The net money flow has been east to west, in what amounts to a colonization of the East. B. The free market is a myth. The West German economy is heavily subsidized and fully regulated, but against the interests of the East. C. West German police are much more brutal than were the East German police. D. If West Germany had denazified anywhere near as thoroughly as it forced the East to desocialize, it would be a totally different country. Citing Z Magazine, July 92. On that last point, it should be noted that German officials are bringing criminal charges against those who, quote, collaborated with the GDR of East Germany in any official capacity, even including teachers and minor administrators. The footnote there, several thousand former GDR officials, judges, and others have been imprisoned or are facing prison terms for, quote, treason. See the discussion in Chapter 5. Back to the text. Emigres from communist states are astonished by the amount of bureaucracy that they find in the West. 2 Soviet immigrants to Canada complained, independently of each other, that, quote, bureaucracy here was even worse than at home, quoting Monthly Review, 588. East Germans living in the West were staggered by the flood of complicated forms that they had to fill out for taxes, health insurance, life insurance, unemployment compensation, job retraining, rent subsidies, and bank accounts. Furthermore, quote, because of the kind of personal information they had to give, they felt more observed and spied on than they were by the Stasi, the GDR security police, quoting Z Magazine, July 92. Soviet Jews who emigrated to Israel during the Cold War era experienced a similar disillusionment with the difficulties of life and lack of idealism. The discouraging letters they sent home were considered an important factor in the drop in immigration from the USSR to Israel. With the capitalist restoration in full swing, the peoples of the former communist nations had ample opportunity to learn what life was like in the free market paradise. Their experiences are detailed in the next chapter. So that is the end of Chapter 6. I'm going to leave it there for this video. In the next video, we'll pick up with Chapter 7, The Free Market Paradise Goes East, Part 2. In the meantime, what do you think? Leave a question or comment below. We'll continue the discussion there. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and thanks to the current patrons whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall. You can sign up for as little as $2 a month or more, whatever you see fit. Every donation is encouraging. They are also materially helpful, so thank you very much for those. Honestly, if you like this channel, thank me. Of course, I'm the one actually recording and uploading and all that stuff. But also thank a patron, because their support has allowed me to do a lot more content and to spend more time on this than I would have been able to do without their support. So it's much appreciated by me. It should be by you as well. Otherwise, liking, sharing, subscribing to, and commenting on the channel and videos, all of that engagement also helps to boost the channel in the YouTube algorithm, helps more people to see this content, and that's really what we're trying to do. We're trying to make actual socialist theory, history, commentary, etc. more accessible, easier for people interested in it to stumble across and to become educated in it. That's what we're trying to do. Obviously, this information is heavily suppressed, and everything that you do to engage with the channel and to support it helps it to be less suppressed, or to fight against that suppression, and again, make it more accessible to people, because they don't want you to know this stuff. They, the capitalists, the people who actually rule the world right now. And of course, knowledge is an important first step, but as the formula goes, agitate, educate, and organize. All the agitation and education in the world only takes you so far. You also have to organize, so join an organization, look around for what's going on in your community. I don't endorse any specific organizations right now, but I would say generally speaking, try to look for something larger rather than smaller that has real community ties, is engaged in active organizing that actually makes some kind of difference in the lives of people in the community, that has healthy intergroup dynamics. People aren't, all angry with each other, stressed out, burned out, whatever, that people generally get along and are civil to each other. Also that interacts with the public in a reasonable way, like responding to requests for information and inquiries in a timely way. If an organization takes 5 or 6 weeks to get back to you, it suggests a number of things: that they're not trying, that they're dysfunctional, or that they kind of just don't care. So anyway, that's kind of what I would look for in an organization when you're ready to join one. Until next time, thanks again for listening, and we'll catch you in the next video.